October 1962. The United States was preparing for nuclear war. Soviet submarines were armed with nuclear torpedoes. American bombers were already in the air. One wrong move, one misunderstood order, and millions would die within hours. For 13 days, the world stood on the edge of extinction. This is the true story of the Cuban Missile Crisis, the closest humanity has ever come to nuclear annihilation. And the terrifying part. Most people have no idea how close we really were. October 1962. For 13 days, the world stood on the edge of nuclear war. The United States and the Soviet Union, the two most powerful nations on Earth, were preparing for a confrontation that could have ended civilization. Missiles were armed, submarines were deployed, bombers were ready. One wrong decision, one misunderstanding, and millions would die. This is the story of the Cuban Missile Crisis, the closest the world has ever come to nuclear annihilation. After World War II, the world split into two superpowers. On one side, the United States. On the other, the Soviet Union. Both possessed nuclear weapons. Both feared each other. The Cold War wasn't fought directly on battlefields between these two giants. Instead, it unfolded through proxy wars, political pressure, espionage, and a terrifying arms race. By the early 1960s, tensions were already high. In 1961, the failed Bay of Pigs invasion, a US-backed attempt to overthrow Cuba's revolutionary leader, humiliated Washington and strengthened Cuba's alliance with Moscow. Cuba's leader, Fidel Castro, now saw the United States as a direct threat, and Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev saw an opportunity. At the time, the United States had nuclear missiles stationed in Turkey and Italy, both within striking distance of the Soviet Union. Khrushchev wanted balance, so in secret, the Soviets began installing nuclear missile sites in Cuba, just 90 miles from Florida. If completed, these missiles could hit major US cities in minutes. But the Americans didn't know yet. On October 14, 1962, an American U-2 spy plane flew over Cuba. The photographs it brought back were undeniable. Missile launch sites, construction crews, Soviet equipment. When President John F. Kennedy was shown the images, he understood immediately. This was an existential threat. Kennedy gathered his closest advisors in a secret group known as ExComm, the Executive Committee of the National Security Council. They debated their options: airstrike, full invasion of Cuba; diplomatic protests, or do no deal. Each option carried enormous risk. An invasion could trigger Soviet retaliation in Europe. An airstrike might miss some missiles and invite nuclear response. The world had never faced a moment like this. Instead of attacking immediately, Kennedy chose a middle path. On October 22, 1962, he addressed the nation on live television. He revealed the existence of the missiles, and he announced a quarantine, effectively a naval blockade, around Cuba. No Soviet ships carrying military equipment would be allowed through. The world watched. Soviet ships were already en route. If they tried to break the blockade, US Navy forces had orders to stop them. And if either side fired the first shot, nuclear war could follow. For several days, the tension escalated. American forces moved to DEFCON, to one step away from nuclear war. Strategic bombers were airborne. Missile crews were on standby. Submarines, armed with nuclear torpedoes, patrolled the oceans. Then came October 24th. Soviet ships approached the blockade line. US destroyers waited. The world held its breath. At the last moment, the Soviet ships slowed and turned around, a small step back from the brink. But the crisis was far from over. One of the least known and most terrifying moments happened underwater. A Soviet submarine near Cuba was detected by US forces. American ships dropped depth charges. Not to destroy it, but to signal it to surface. But the submarine crew didn't know that. They believed war may have already started. On board was a nuclear torpedo. The captain considered launching it. Under Soviet protocol, 3 officers had to agree. 2 said yes. 1 said No. That officer, Vasily Arkhipov, refused to authorize the launch. His decision may have prevented nuclear war. The world never knew how close it had come. Meanwhile, Khrushchev sent Kennedy a letter. It was emotional, almost personal. He proposed removing the missiles from Cuba if the United States promised not to invade. The next day, a second letter arrived, harsher, more demanding. It required the U.S. to also remove its missiles from Turkey. Excom debated intensely. Which letter should they respond to? Kennedy chose to publicly respond to the first letter, agreeing not to invade Cuba, while privately agreeing to remove U.S. missiles from Turkey later. It was a delicate dance of diplomacy and pride. On October 28, 1962, Khrushchev announced that Soviet missiles in Cuba would be dismantled and removed. In exchange, the U.S. pledged not to invade Cuba, and secretly American missiles in Turkey would be withdrawn. The crisis was over 13 days. That's all it took to nearly destroy the world. The Cuban Missile Crisis changed global politics forever. Both leaders were shaken by how close they had come to catastrophe. Soon after, a direct hotline was installed between Washington and Moscow. Nuclear arms control talks began. In 1963, the Partial Nuclear Test Ban Treaty was signed. The Cold War would continue for decades. But after October 1962, both sides understood the true cost of miscalculation. The Cuban Missile Crisis remains the most dangerous confrontation in modern history. It showed how fear can escalate conflict, pride can delay compromise, and communication can prevent disaster. It also revealed something deeply human. Behind the headlines and military strategies were individuals making choices under unbearable pressure. A president weighing invasion. A premier defending his nation's pride. A submarine officer refusing to turn a key. History sometimes hinges on a single decision, and in October 1962, those decisions saved the world. For 13 days, humanity stared into the abyss. There were no heroes in capes, no dramatic final battles, just tension, uncertainty, and restraint. The Cuban Missile Crisis reminds us, peace is not automatic. It is negotiated, protected, and sometimes narrowly saved.